This is the first in our series of lectures on the history of American literature. As we have talked about in class, literature and history are inseparable. Historical happenings are recorded in literature, poems, novels, short stories, essays, articles, letters, etc., and literature oftentimes influences historical happenings. To make our understanding of this relationship easier, we will study our American literary experiences by focusing on chronological time periods. The first time period we will look at is what we will call here colonialism or Puritanism. This period takes place from roughly 1607 to 1750, from the Jamestown settlement to just before the key events of the American Revolution. So on to a brief history lesson. We will begin our focus by jumping ahead to around 1620, because that is when the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts, and because it is precisely this group of people and others like them who had some of the strongest literary and cultural influences on the colonies. The Pilgrims, who were a highly devout group of religious dissenters from England, were also called separatists because of their desire to break away from or separate completely from the Anglican Church, otherwise known as the Church of England. Many Pilgrims chose to flee to Holland and other places to avoid persecution, but the group we are most interested in, as you will likely recall from your elementary school days, sailed in a ship called the Mayflower. And in 1620, they landed in a place we now know as Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. For all of their diligence and learning, many of them were well-educated folks, they failed to plan their arrival at a time that would allow for them to plant crops and put food away for the winter. Their voyage left them few provisions, and it would take time to send away for more supplies from England. And even though they did receive some assistance from the Native Americans, that was a rather dicey sort of relationship, fraught with turmoil and ups and downs. Thus they suffered greatly over a harsh winter, losing many who would have been hardy enough initially to have survived the sea voyage. Enough did survive, however, which paved the way for more settlers. While many of the early settlers were Pilgrims, a somewhat less radical group known as the Puritans soon started to flock to the new land. These folks, while still quite religiously strict and devout, sought not to separate from the Church of England, but rather to purify it. In fact, they came over to show the Church of England how it's done, so to speak. They planned to build what they called a city on a hill, a beacon for all the world to see. And as Americans, we still use this term today, especially in the political arena. Around an election time, you might hear political figures using that term. These Puritans were also quite well educated. Many of them were well funded, and even so, their beliefs dictated that they live a mostly plain and simple life, which was quite different from the styles in England and the rest of Europe at the time. As this picture represents, the custom overseas was to wear rich, ornate clothing, to decorate with a lot of ornamentation. Architecture was a little bit over the top, and literature and music as well. Puritans, however, as this picture represents, rejected the ostentatious display of wealth and outward appearance, as they deemed it to be unfitting for Christians. The Puritans incorporated religion into their daily lives, as is evident with their dress. Their faith was never very far from their thoughts. They focused on three main doctrines: the Bible as the only source of God's law, the belief in original sin, and the certainty of predestination. Now, quite quickly here, the Bible as the only source of God's law. For many Puritans, that they came from a tradition where a higher person in the church told them what to believe, told them what the Bible said, and they believed that they could read it for themselves. They also believed that there was no other law of the land or anything else that took precedence over what the Bible said. The Bible is the only source that you go to. You don't go to the church or any other place necessarily for that interpretation. The belief in original sin has to do with the Genesis story in the Bible. That's the first book in the Bible. And very briefly here, God created man and woman, and he put them in a perfect garden where the only tree they could not eat from was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Unfortunately, the devil, in the form of a snake, tempted Eve to eat the fruit of that tree. Eve then tempted Adam to do the same, and both acts are called original sin. Because of that original sin, God kicked them out of the garden. They broke God's law. They sinned. And since they were the very first humans, they sort of blew it for all human beings. So every human being, according to the Puritans, is born inheriting, as it were, that sin, that original sin. So each new baby is actually born not innocent, but sinful. Now, if that doesn't sit well with you, wait until you hear about predestination. Predestination is a little bit more difficult and complicated than I'm going to address here, but basically, the simple explanation is that the Puritans believe that since God is all-knowing, he also knows right away when you're born who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. And in fact, these post-mortem locations are set in stone. There isn't really much anyone can do about them. Still, they believed that it was pretty easy to see who was one of the chosen ones, because good health, good fortune, etc. would naturally settle more predominantly on the chosen ones than on those headed for the fiery pits of hell. As you can imagine, the thought that your neighbor might not be as fortunate as you in the afterlife sometimes set up some pretty serious gossip and some pretty serious paranoia. We'll talk more about this, the more dire effects of this philosophy a little bit later in the year. As previously stated, one indicator of that your after-death party would be inside the pearly gates and not outside was your ability to be prosperous in this life. Good fortune, according to the Puritans, often indicated being one of God's chosen, and that is really what the Puritans thought of themselves. They thought that they were the chosen people. Puritans were instructed, however, even though their after-death locations were already set in stone, so to speak, were instructed not to take part in any number of earthly pleasures, which included, but was not limited to, dancing, attending the theater, reading fiction, gambling, etc. Though it sounds pretty boring, these people really didn't have any leisure time anyway. They were far too busy trying to survive in a wilderness. Their survival, in fact, depended upon them being a close-knit community, something that their religious beliefs actually helped them to do. They cared for each other, sacrificed for each other, and they offered each other comfort, which in large part contributed to their ability to survive and ultimately thrive. Many of the Puritans were well educated, and they put a high value on education. After all, their faith relied in large part on their ability to read and interpret the Bible. Thus, the Puritans were great supporters of all people in a society receiving an education. Now, this included women, who in Europe and England at the time were largely not permitted that same luxury. Oftentimes, even aristocratic women weren't necessarily allowed to learn how to read. And allowing women to read, in fact, insisting that women learn how to read, was a pretty radical approach in most parts of the world at that time. So the Puritans were sort of forward-thinking in that respect. And actually, you can not only credit the Puritans with allowing women to read and wanting all people in their society to read, but also with founding the first college, Harvard College. And this directly affects you. You can also thank them in large part that you are sitting now and receiving a public school education. So take a moment to thank a Puritan. Despite some decidedly forward thinking in education, the Puritans were less tolerant regarding how they governed their communities. They practiced a slightly modified form of what is known as a theocracy. Though their government was only partially theocratic in nature, the structure of a theocratic government created a rather rigid and restrictive form of running a society. Puritan society, in short, was governed using the Bible as the source of religious as well as governmental and societal rules and regulations. Thus, if a person were to break one of the Ten Commandments or were to go against the Bible, they could face legal consequences. The clergy or the minister also in a theocratic society had strong influences and ties in the government. So regularly attending church and remaining on your minister's good side would be quite important. Given what we now know about the Puritans, what can you expect, do you think, from Puritan literature? What do you think they were writing? What do you think they were reading? Can you make some educated guesses? Well, Dr. Seuss would likely not be welcomed in a Puritan home or establishment because it is fiction. First, Puritan literature needed to serve a purpose. It needed to be plain and practical, much like their dress and their whole approach to life. This means no fiction. In fact, acceptable literature included either devotional, otherwise known as religious, or practical, which would example would be like the Farmer's Almanac, travel logs, diaries, letters, instructional manuals, things like that. Basically, if the piece was not for the betterment of someone's soul or for the betterment of his or her crops and daily living, etc., then it was considered frivolous and possibly even dangerous. In short, Puritans saw the value in documenting their experiences for the good of others. Let's be clear, however, the Puritans were not anti-books. In fact, the very first book published in North America was the Bay Psalm book, which actually combined religion and education. True to the pure and plain style that the Puritans highly regarded in all things, the Bay Psalm book featured what the Puritans considered to be a direct translation of the Psalms without all the poetry and frivolity that accompanied the St. James, which is the first English translation of the Bible, the St. James Bible. It was part of the St. James Bible to have poetry and verse, and the Psalms especially lent themselves beautifully to that. The Puritans said, no, God's Word is good enough on its own. We don't need to flower it up with poetry and sweet language. And so they wrote the Bay Psalm book. Eventually, the book was even used throughout parts of England and Scotland for over 100 years. Now, take a good look at this book, because if you happen to find a first edition copy in your great-uncle's attic, run, don't walk, to the nearest antique roadshow, because the last one sold at auction for over $14 million. Chances are slim, however, that you're going to find one, as there are possibly now only 10 in existence today. If the Puritans were a bit too cold and restrictive for you, perhaps you will enjoy the earlier, more southern settlers. The Jamestown, Virginia settlement, far to the south of Plymouth, Massachusetts, predates the Mayflower folks by a few years. These settlers landed in 1607 and had a very different motive for settling on this new continent. They were in it for good old-fashioned money. The Puritans may have come here in part for religious freedom, but the first British settlers were interested in making money and carving it out of the wilderness. These folks, these Jamestown folks, were also heavily tied to the Church of England. They had no desire to split and become a city on a hill and purify the church, and they were also tied quite well to the British government. Thus, the southern colonies had many less items on their don't-do list than the Puritans had. These colonies to the south were also more egalitarian in nature, which means agriculturally based. Instead of the close-knit community that the Puritans had, the southern colonies were much more spread out and compartmentalized in the form of plantations and farms. They did, however, know how to party. They enjoyed intermittent social gatherings. They were not afraid to dance, drink, and make merry. A class system also existed, much like their British partners, but in the form of plantation owners, farmers, slaves, and servants. Overall, the earlier colonies, both northern and southern, shared similar forms of literature. They all documented their lives in the form of journals, letters, travel logs, almanacs, to name a few. But it was only the Puritans who chose to forego worldly literature, such as drama, poetry, and fiction, for the more heavenly pursuits of religious readings. Well, to close, let's take a look at some of the people who were writing at the time, both north and south. John Smith, yes, the Pocahontas guy, wrote the immensely informative The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles. Puritan and first Plymouth settler William Bradford, who served as governor for 33 years in Plymouth, wrote one of the most monumental pieces of American nonfiction entitled Of Plymouth Plantation, which we will be reading shortly. Also, something we will be reading shortly is Anne Bradstreet. She was a Puritan woman, and she represents not only the first American woman writer, but also the first published American writer. Oddly, she's most noted for publishing poetry, such as Upon the Burning of My House and To My Dear and Loving Husband. You may wonder how it is acceptable for a Puritan to write poetry, no less a woman, and you can probably also guess that that poetry had to be devotional or religious in nature in order for it to be acceptable. Thanks for listening. I'm sure you feel as though you, like the first settlers, may have just completed a long and arduous journey, but just like those brave individuals, your journey's just beginning. Indeed, let's work together to make our walk through American literary history educational, rewarding, and occasionally a little bit of fun. See you soon.